Do you know those atonal atmospheres that you hear a lot in darkspy? Well, recently I had a project where I needed to make them and I didn't really know a lot about them, so I decided to experiment a little bit and this is what I came up with. Here you can see we have a project. This is actually the same project as from the last video, which was in regards to creating this sequence over here. For those that have seen that video, they'll know the sound, but they'll also know that it's changed quite significantly. As you can see, I'm experimenting with a vocoder and a spectral resonator in here. Maybe I'll do a separate video on some of these effects as well. But for those that have seen the last video, they will remember the project and they'll probably remember that the intro sounded very bland. We had a few one-shots in there, which I eventually moved out of there. So for the first segment of the drop, the kick and bass was just playing on its own at that point in the project. And I decided that I found the synth sound so interesting that I want to just elaborate a little bit on the idea and see if I can write a little bit more of a track out of this. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to have something that could transition from the intro into the drop itself. And this is what I came up with. So as you can probably tell, most of that is happening in this paths and atmospheres group. There's one like atmospheric one shot, which we might also take a look at in a little bit. But I mainly want to focus on these long atmospheres over here. Now what you'll see is that there's a lot of extra files in here. This is all turned off, as you can see from the mixer over here. And this was my initial experimentation for this particular kind of sound. I got some sounds out of that. That's the sounds that are on these two tracks here. We're getting some cool stuff from that as well. But it wasn't exactly what I was looking for. So what I ended up doing is I ended up just contacting one of my viewers who actually makes that kind of psytrance. I remembered the specific track from him that he submitted to the feedback streams where I actually really enjoyed the atmospheres. So I decided to just ask him about him and he sent over a couple of different patches, which allowed me to first of all just have the patches in the project over here. Here you can see one of his patches. There's another one over here that I'm using. And then there's a final one here as well. And for these patches, I wanted to both just use them in the track because I think they sounded nice, but I also wanted to understand their sound design and how they actually work. Now, there's really two different approaches that you can have to this kind of sound design. You can have the generative approach, where you randomize a whole bunch of different parameters as the sounds are playing, and you just record that and pick the specific section that you like most. Or you can try to sound design exactly what you want in terms of tonality, in terms of texture, whatever it is that you're actually after. And once you have captured that, you have created one sound for your track. Now we'll start with the generative approach over here. As you can see, we're running a vital patch where there's a little bit of randomization involved. As you can see, these two random modulators over here as well. Don't get confused with this random amplitudes over here. This is actually fully deterministic in the sense that if you take a value like this over here and you just copy it over to a new one over here, you get the exact same waveform. Which means that yes, this is some kind of random process, but this is a predetermined random process. There's a random seed in here somewhere, and if you use the same parameter controls and the same modulation, it will always generate the same kind of sound. In this case, we're interested in these randomness over here because these change with different notes. As you can see, this one changes every 4 bars, which is just as long as the main envelope that we're using for the sound. So you can see we're using this sample and hold randomness to select the different parts of this random amp here. This is what is actually introducing the randomness, not the fact that this is random amp over here, because as we saw, it is dependent on the position of this knob over here. We have the second randomness over here, which is modulating the pitch of the oscillator. Now with this being random amplitude, you can imagine that this is very atonal, the sound that you're going to get from this. But it's not yet going to have a lot of movement, because if you look at what we're actually doing here, we're adding just a little bit of movement to it. The reason for that happens if we look back into here. A little bit of movement can drastically alter the waveform. And we don't actually want to morph through a whole bunch of different states in here. We just want a little bit of change over time, because our main movement is going to come from this pitch modulation over here. So you have this little bit of movement on this particular parameter here, which is also randomly changing in time, changing us the texture. And then some other movement that we have is just the volume going up, as well as this filter opening up over time. You can see the main goal of the effect is smearing it out and making it transition in over time. The only thing that doesn't really belong in any of those categories is this one over here. This is just a high pass to remove any potential low frequencies, but you can see that the filter is used to fade it in, and then the other three effects, the chorus, the delay, and the reverb are used to kind of smear out the sound. Especially the reverb is very helpful for something very atmospheric. So this is all generative. As you can probably tell, we're using random modulators to generate the sound for us. But you can imagine that it should be fairly easy to just convert it into something that is deterministic, that always plays back in the same way, and that just generates the exact texture that you want. All we really have to do is take these two randomizers and replace them with macros. So we can go in here, set this to macro 1. We can go in here and set this to macro 2. This one is set to bipolar mode, so if you want it to work normally, you just turn this up like this to 0.5. And that should be your starting position for any automation that you're making. And this will just change the tonality of your sound over here. And now you can imagine that we can just use these controls to exactly determine what we want our sound to sound like. So I can go in here and I can say, well, I want this one over here, this one over here, this one over here. Notice that I'm using these kind of steps over here. I don't actually want it to change over time. We already have a modulation for that setup. This is just to determine the random position of this parameter here. And of course, we're doing it in steps of 4 bars because that is how long it takes for one of these atmospheres to play, for one of these LFOs to kind of oscillate once. And you can see the sound only really exists towards the end here because it's tied to the volume and the filter cutoff. Let's get macro 2 in the mix as well. I'm just going to start somewhat like this. You can have steps in here, doesn't really matter, I think. And now you'll get something like this. And just to prove that it always plays back in the same way, if I play again from here, you can hear that last part again. Here I have another patch that is completely deterministic, in that it doesn't use any randomness. Well, I say that there's this one macro over here that we'll come to later, which you can see does control random over here. But when the sound first starts to play, it is completely deterministic. You can hear where it starts being a little bit more random, and if we look into the automation, you can see that as well. Here the randomness goes up right before the drop, so you start getting random pitches over here. So this is another interesting kind of atmosphere. The way that this one works is that I'm just using the frequency stack over here, and I'm just using the unison feature here with a lot of spread and a lot of range as well. We're controlling both the detune and the spread with the same knob over here. We have a macro controlling this filter over here. This is just a bandpass filter over here, just the 2 times. And then we're also changing the wavetail position over time as well. Finally, you can see this random over here is controlling the shifts here. This is just like a hertz shift up and down. So this is actually bipolar, so this is just modulating it up and down. And it gives that flowing feeling to it, which you hear in the drop part. And then again, to just smooth out the sound here, you can see we have a single reverb. This time it's fully wet. So that means that you'll only hear the reverb sound. So that is actually the whole atmosphere. The dry sound doesn't come through in any way. And that was because this sound was quite sharp and I didn't want it to be. I didn't want that kind of saw wave clicky part of it. So I'm just completely smoothing it out altogether. Now, as you can probably tell, those 2 patches were surprisingly simple. There are more difficult ways that you can do this. Obviously, there is always a way that you can over-engineer things, and that is also what I've done for the last part of this video. Before that though, I quickly want to talk about their placement. So just having a look at the rendered out versions over here, what you'll see is that I'm essentially trying to do the division rule that I've explained before when it comes to arrangement. I explained the division rule in my guide to arrangement for Psytrance. But basically what it means is that if you have a section like this, which in our case is 16 bars long, you can see 15 bars of kick and bass, and then the 16th bar is the fill here. What we can do for our placement is we can divide it up. We take the start point and the end point, and we just divide that up, so we get to the middle over here, and we can start placing an atmosphere here. Now in this case, the way that I like to think of the atmospheres is that they have a high point in the middle of the sound. So right over here, right over here, right over there, and right over here in this case. You can see this waveform is a little bit altered. It just comes in very early. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking at like these kind of high points. And what I like to do is have those on the divisions. Because I say divisions, you don't have to make one, right? We saw that the division was over here, but there's actually no atmosphere actually kind of like fading in and fading out from this point. That happens over here, over here, over here, and over here. So you can just continue making more divisions to get to those points actually. So if you go to the end, which by the way is one of the points that we're fading into for this particular atmosphere over here, we can make that division here, and we can make that division again, and then we do fade into that point. So this is kind of like a second division. And then for this one, you would need a third division, mainly between here and here, to get to the exact points that I'm placing it in. Now, of course, there's more happening still. These are just layers on top of the main atmospheres, which are over here. This one is fading into each endpoint here of every 4 bars. So here, 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 here. It's fading into each of them. Whereas this one, what is really happening, if we look at the macro, is you can see it's kind of fading into here, 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 and here. And the reason for that has to do with how this patch works. Because the synth is kind of coming from very high down to a point, you'll see that it actually starts to introduce more and more stuff in here, because there's more frequencies in this part than there is in the very high frequencies. So it's kind of fading in over this period of here as the frequency goes lower. And then as the frequency goes higher, it starts to fade out again. So in terms of placement, that is the rule that I'm following. Now let's have a look into the final patch. And the final patch is what is generating all of these sounds over here, which we looked at before in terms of their placement. It started off as this kind of generative patch over here. The way that this idea really came together was that I wanted to make something that had all of the kind of core features of these kind of atmospheres. So we had these constantly changing tones, we had these constantly changing pitches, we had these constantly changing modulations on top of it. All of that I wanted to emulate in this particular chain over here. So what I did for the different textures is I just used 4 instances of Serum, all with different pad presets loaded. And then as you can see, they also all have a pitch bend over here. And this pitch bend is just modulated by this random over here, which as you can see has a lot of smoothing. So you get this kind of nice curve to it. You can see it kind of sliding up. Sometimes it will slide down. In this case, it just went to almost the same position. But here you have a good example of it just sliding down. That is that initial pitch movement that you hear in all of the patches. That is just being done by the pitch bend. So it doesn't really matter what kind of pad you have in here. I can open up one of these presets, but I believe this is just a default Serum preset, this old drone over here. There's a bunch more in here as well. I'm not going to go over it, it's not that interesting. What is interesting is how we're triggering between them, because we don't want to play all of the pads all the time. We obviously want to have different textures over time, and that means that we should probably trigger different pad sounds all the time. So the way this works is we're using some generation over here. First of all, let's have a look at the MIDI, which you'll see is just a whole bunch of notes. They're 1 bar long, which gives me ample of time for the release of this sound. So then in the chain, we start off with this arpeggiator over here, which is set to random other, meaning that for all of the notes that we see in this MIDI clip, only one of them is going to get played. We then have the scale over here, which just puts those notes back into the scale that we actually after, which doesn't really matter because we're pitch bending them anyway afterwards. But it's always nice to work in a way that if I were to turn off the pitch bend, I'm immediately back into the scale that I'm working in, so that I don't have any trouble in that regard. The next step is this random O over here. This is randomizing the velocities, and we're essentially using that random velocity here to select the chain selector. So we have this expression control where the velocity is linked to the chain selector over here, which is then doing the choosing of the different patches for us. So with the random velocity, it's just going to play one of these 4 patches at random. As you can see, it has an equal chance of choosing between any 4 of them. And then you can see as a final step, we just have a big reverb over here, which is fully wet. You can see a nice long length here as well, so this is just used to completely smooth out the sound. But I wasn't really happy with the result. Like all of the characteristics were there, the main characteristics, in that it changes tone, it has this very washed out sound with the reverb, there's the pitch bend in there. So what I decided to do is decided to record 10 of the sounds here. As you can see, these are 10 sounds. And then I decided to put them into a simpler. Now, inside of the simpler, what I did is I did a little bit of magic with this LFO over here together with this remapper. As you can see, there's like 10 steps over here, meaning that this remapper is going to choose exactly the 10 starting points, which you can see over here. This remapper is going into the multi-multi together with this LFO, and this LFO is what is creating the sliding effect. So it will start with any one of the starting points of these little like fade-ins that you see in here, and then it will just slice through that part of the sample. You can see it doing it now. In the way that we're doing that, we're actually halving the speed because we're playing it back at half the speed as it was originally played. As you can see, these are all 2 bars here. Again, in the audio, you can see it's 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars, 2 bars here. And we're actually using 4 bars to play it back because this is what determines the playback speed. This is the offset here, which is doing what this part is doing over here. It's just playing back from one segment to the next, essentially. In doing so, what we're essentially doing is we're just stretching up this file. We're making it a little bit longer. That gives us a longer time for the modulation to actually take place, but it also just adds a nice texture to it because this is almost kind of like granular synthesis in a way. It's not exactly granular synthesis. Don't get me wrong, you could do some amazing stuff with actual granular synthesis as well, where you could play multiple of these parts at the same time actually. But for here, I just kind of wanted to get the granular synthesis texture in there without actually doubling up on the sounds that were played because I wanted to maintain the unique texture of each of the individual sounds. After that, on this part, there's some more effects here. The main effect that is really changing it up here is this amp transformer. As you can see, we're using 3 LFOs, both on the pitch shift, the performance shift, and the dry wet here. You can see those knobs actually going crazy in here, dry wet, pitch shift, and performance shift. Also note that we don't want this pitch shift to affect the performance. We are already performance shifting here, so we're just turning up the key performance that keeps the performance intact while it is pitch shifting. This is really helpful in the pitch shifter actually. It really changes the characteristics of the pitch shifter, makes it much more versatile. But in this case, it is just used so that we can control the performance manually. The final effects here are a little bit of echo boy and a little bit of reverb. And then we have a final EQ here to just remove some lower frequencies, add a little bit of those higher frequencies, and then you get something that sounds like this. And now you can start to hear that we really are getting those kind of textures that we're after. It's starting to sound complex, it's starting to sound always morphing, and it doesn't sound like your normal kind of pad sound anymore. So then what I did is I rendered out a whole bunch of different variations of that. And what I've been doing now is essentially I've been doing it in the same way that I started this part over here. Again, from the last video, I talked about how to make that sequence in a very similar way, in that you just pick and choose the ones that you really like. As you can see, we have this whole, almost like a folder thing of different atmospheres that we can choose from. And as you can see, I've just placed them in the track the way that I like them. Now, it should probably be said that this last patch over here is a little bit of a hassle, as you can probably tell from the fact that you need like 5 chains for it to work. You don't have to do it this way. This is the kind of experiment that I like to do, you know, just for an evening instead of going out with friends. If you enjoyed this kind of thing, it is very fun to get into this kind of sound design. I must say that it's very enjoyable working like this. For me, I do like the generative approach a little bit more than the controlled approach, where you know exactly what you want, usually because I am not exactly sure what I want. Like, I usually have a good idea of what I want the flow of a sound to be like, but I never really have an idea of what the best texture for a sound is. And with the fact that here I have a whole bunch of different textures with essentially the same flow over and over again, because that is how we designed the sound. Again, because of this playback over here, the way that it's playing back and the way that all of these waves have essentially the same form here, right? It takes a little bit of time to fade up and then it takes a while to fade out. That is basically true for all of these. So the resulting playback is always going to have a very similar flow as well. And in this case, I just mean the flow of the sound in terms of its volume over time. The final thing I'll say is that I usually layer other sounds on top of it as well. This is kind of like an atmosphere, but it's really just a found sound that I found somewhere in the sample pack or in Omnisphere. I might have rendered this out from Omnisphere. It sounds very big, but what I believe it was some kind of impact sound, which I then reversed. And the main big sound that is obviously coming from it comes from the delay and the reverb as well. It sounds much thinner like this. Of course, like this, it fades out nicely and it has a nicer curve to it as well, in the sense that just like the atmospheres themselves, they're just kind of fading up here and then they're fading down again. So that's going to be it. That's everything that I wanted to say about your atmospheres. Obviously, there's a lot of experimentation in here. I don't think that I said a lot of very precise things that you need to like exactly do like this. I think from the video you can tell that the sound design is very liberal. There's just a basic few characteristics that were after a lot of movement and a lot of smoothing of the sound. And usually you want to go for something a little bit atonal and a little bit high pitched as well. So that's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you did by leaving a like. And if you want to continue watching something, there will be 2 videos up on the screen right now, which YouTube will think you will enjoy. So that's it. See you in the next one. Bye bye.